Thank you, everyone, for joining us, everyone who's here in person and everyone who's online at home. It's so wonderful having a live stream option so that we can have people not just in the Portland area, but from all over that can join us. So thank you for being here. Thank you to West Hills Covenant Church that allows us this generous, beautiful space to use for these classes that we host once a month on the last Tuesday of the month. So here we are in March, headed towards April. I'm Mary Edmonds. I know most of you, or I've gotten to meet most of you, but there's many that I don't know. I have the privilege of working here at the Faber Institute with Father Rick Gans. And Father Gans does a lot of our night school classes, but tonight we have the wonderful opportunity to have a friend of the Institute here with us tonight. Many of you know Paul Pastor. Many of you know him very well. His parents are here. And Paul is a wonderful friend of the Faber Institute. He is a writer, an author, an editor, a speaker, and a poet. And he and his wife, Emily, who is a lovely artist and painter, live in the Columbia River Gorge with their 3 children. I like to have somewhat of a theme for the foods based on whoever our guest, in this case, T.S. Eliot, is. And there wasn't really an obvious one for T.S. Eliot. So at least for the wine, I went for wines from the Columbia River Gorge in honor of Paul. So that was kind of the best I could do for tonight. Paul serves HarperCollins as a senior acquisitions editor for Zondervan Books. He was previously with Penguin Random House as an editor, working with many authors, including a local friend of ours, John Mark Comer from Bridgetown Church, which is a fun connection. Paul is also the author of Luis Palau's memoir, Palau, A Life on Fire. And that's another fun connection with the Faber Institute because our offices are hosted in the Palau Association building. And Paul is, obviously great friends with that family and that organization. So it's really cool to see some different threads that connect those of us in the community, and that we get to have friends and organizations, individuals that support each other and know each other and collaborate in our works. You may have heard Paul speak in some of our past night school classes. Last year, he came and introduced us to Charles Williams, and a few years before that, he introduced us to George MacDonald, and tonight he's here to introduce us to T.S. Eliot. And I could go on and on about his works and accomplishments, which are many, but I wanted to just take a piece out of the Bower Lodge, which is one of your newer, but not your newest, his recent poetry collection, part of the foreword, which I thought explains a lot of how it is that Paul overlaps a lot with our works here at the Institute, in which Abigail Carroll, who wrote the foreword, says, of this book, but we could think of it in regards to our night school class. Let us embark on this journey with a soulful curiosity, a curiosity that promises a bright return for our wonder, a curiosity that makes room for the strangely beautiful design which unfold among our living, our dying, our transformations, and our redemption. In the night school class, because we just have an hour, a short amount of time to think through the life and the impact of a life like T.S. Eliot. It's a way to introduce and make us wonder about that person and to make you just think so that maybe after this class, you will go and do some exploring of T.S. Eliot on your own. So with that, I'll bring Paul Pastor up and he'll lead us into our evening. Oh, I'm going to pass this around. Just we send out follow-up.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm privileged to do not a ton of speaking, but a fair amount of speaking. And whether from genetics or overconfidence, I'm not sure. I very rarely get nervous. And I will confess to you that I have been nervous about tonight. And I'll tell you why. There's a possibly apocryphal story about the subject of our evening, T.S. Eliot, in which in or around 1922, when The Wasteland, one of his really major works, was released, he did a public reading of the poem. He got up and he read the whole poem. And at the end, there was a brief time for questions, and someone asked him, Mr. Eliot, what does your poem mean? and he stared at them, and he proceeded to reread the entire poem. So if T.S. Eliot was unwilling or unable to explain his master work, who am I to stand up here and talk to you for an hour about that same work? I ought to feel nervous. I ought to feel humble. And yet I embark on this with a sense of hope and a sense of excitement because I have gotten such genuine joy and genuine benefit out of reading the poetry of this man. We're going to talk a little bit about his life tonight. We're going to talk about what I believe to be one of the great questions that we encounter through all of his work. And then hopefully by the time we leave, we will all share really a handle. That's the way that I want to think about it, a handle with which to grab not only his work, but the way that his work touches the great question, which touches your life. If we just leave here talking about a dead man's poetry, that would be fine. If we leave here with you feeling that you have a new language or a new name for some of the pain or dilemma or despair or hope that you encounter in your daily life, I will feel like my nervousness has been justified. So let's try that. Let's try that. So that great question that I want to ask is, how do we being people and we being individuals, how do we make peace with time? How do we make peace with time? That sounds very abstract and very philosophical. And at moments, a question like that needs to be abstract and philosophical. Philosophers have job security for a reason. There's no other way to really think about it. But it's not a mere intellectual toy to ask that question. It holds profound spiritual danger. And precisely because it is so dangerous, it holds profound spiritual opportunity. Across our lifespans, there are certain key and core experiences that we all are going to share, regardless of when we live, where we live, regardless of our race, of our gender, of our class, of our life experiences. Many of the most basic human experiences are so close to us that they are like water to a fish. If fish could see the water, they could see nothing else. Time for us is like that water. We move in it. We swim in it. It brings things to us, and it takes things away from us. It is our natural spiritual habitat. And because of that, we find ourselves in a world of change, don't we? Biological change. I'm finding gray hairs. Spiritual change. I'm different on the inside than I was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Relational change. I'm growing in my friendships. I'm growing in my relationship with my wife. And in such a world of change, conditions arise for good things and for difficulties, for regret, for grief. We lose things, we lose opportunities, we lose relationships. Eventually, we begin in earnest to lose people. And this is not just individual, this is also mirrored on the scale of our culture, isn't it? Nations rise and fall. Forests rise and fall. The ice caps form, the ice caps melt, the ice caps reform, the ice caps remelt. Pyramids are built and the jungle swallows them. It's amazing. The social fabric is woven, or it frays, or it breaks altogether. And in each of those movements, whether on the scale of the globe or on the scale of a generation, things are lost and it hurts. The experience of living in time is the experience of living in pain. Isn't that what it is to be alive? This is my experience. Is it also yours? Yes. So the question that we are forced to ask, although we usually don't recognize it, is how do we do this? How do we make peace with time? Each of us, if we had the time to share tonight, could describe, if we were honest enough, our own relationship over the course of our life to time. Perhaps the root temptation for you is to try and control things. Perhaps the root temptation is to distract. There's many different ways that we can engage it, with regret, with anxiety, with gallows humor, with despair, with hope. But all of those unhealthy relationships to time will eventually betray us. They will create futility, vanity, broken relationships. The list is very long. Right now, and we will get to T.S. Eliot very quickly. Right now, we are also living in a time of what the true term decadence would describe. Decadence as a culture, as a civilization, particularly in the West. Decadence means a loss of rhythm, a loss of beat. If we think even over the course of our own quite short lives, does it feel like the world is playing music rhythmically together? Or does it feel like everybody is in a cacophony of competition? Obviously the latter, right? The West has undergone massive changes since the Industrial Revolution, changes that are taking centuries to percolate out. And we are living in a time that the Hebrew prophets would have used language like this to describe. The fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. We are experiencing the flavors of things eaten centuries ago. And we're experiencing that through a loss of cadence. Spiritually, culturally, our narratives are breaking down. This movement is not new. It feels very fresh to us because we haven't lived very long, but it's not new. And actually 100 years ago, everything I just described would have been felt very keenly by a young poet from St. Louis, Missouri, trying very hard to be British, named Thomas Stearns Eliot. He would have felt that displacement in time, and he would have felt very painfully the decadence of the culture. Let's move to his biography. Born in 1888, T.S. Eliot was obviously a poet, an essayist, a literary critic, and a playwright. He is widely regarded now as one of the most significant literary voices of the 20th century, and his work had huge impact on what we now call modernist literature and the entire literature of the West. It is not an exaggeration to say that in 200 years, it's very likely that T.S. Eliot is one of 2 or 3 poets who will be remembered for the span of time between the Industrial Revolution and whatever's going to come next. It's probably going to be Walt Whitman and T.S. Eliot. He essentially invented a new kind of poetic diction, a new way of doing poetry that, we'll get to that in a moment. But his work was deeply in touch with the decadence and the alienation and the decay that characterized the early part of the 20th century. The rise of industrialization, the rise of what they then called the Great War, World War I, with an unprecedented disdain for human life and a mechanistic ability to destroy any semblance of the old ways of warfare, with poison gas and machine guns and tanks and a new mechanized way of destroying entire nations. His style that he developed was deeply elusive, pulling in all sorts of voices and traditions and references in what we might call to be like a literary imitation of what he saw happening in broader culture. It was also a very exciting time to be alive. He had been born in the Victorian age. He was coming of age in the Jazz age. There were electric lights. There were restaurants popping up with these novel cuisines that people hadn't tasted before. Jazz was happening. There's all this really exciting things that was happening too. And so for the first time, he had this sense of living sort of as a global citizen, particularly in Europe where he was educated. So born in St. Louis, Missouri, to a well-to-do Unitarian family who had old, rich Boston roots, T.S. Eliot moved to England in 1914, and he eventually became a British citizen and would call himself British for the rest of his life. He studied at Harvard, where his studies included Sanskrit and Indian philosophy, and later at Oxford, where he became interested in the works of the French symbolist poets and the English metaphysical and devotional poets, particularly John Donne. World War I interrupted those studies, and he never took his final oral examination for his PhD. In 1914, as the war was beginning, Eliot began a close association with the American poet Ezra Pound, who was originally from Idaho. I don't know if you knew that, but I'm a fan of Pound occasionally, and he's a Northwesterner. Their correspondence and friendship really started the movement of literary modernism. They talked a lot, they corresponded a lot, they made the same sort of really unfortunate mistakes in their poetry, like constantly putting in like these bizarre dated references to completely obscure works in the original script. So there's Greek and Sanskrit and ancient Chinese and all this weird stuff that they put in there just to show off. It was very rude, totally ignore it, but also very exciting. They were doing something new, and they were seeing traction almost immediately as they were releasing this to their peers. People were excited by what was being done. Eliot was 26 at the outbreak of the First World War in 1914 and 51 at the beginning of the Second in 1939. And this is important because as we think about this nature of time, his years of childhood had been lived in years with 18s at the beginning of them, right? And so it's really difficult, I think, looking back now, to really imagine the difference in mindset between that late Victorian era and what was to come in the early part of the 20th century. It would have felt like huge and dark principalities were at work in the world of industry and inhumanity. The myth of progress and plenty that was so popular at like the World's Fair, the World's Fairs of like the late 1800s, totally had popped by the time Eliot was a young man. These giant glass conservatories and all of, the Chicago World's Fair, where all of the nations of the world came and showed, hey, we've beaten the problems of sickness and of human conflict, and really this like triumphalism. That dream was completely gone by the time Eliot was a young man. And it would have felt unbelievably disillusioning. So it was out of that sense of smallness in the face of those kind of gears of history that Eliot began to work. His first major publication, after some really unfortunate, very conventional early work that, everyone's got to get that stuff out of their system, was the poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which surely some of us in this room have read. It came out in 1915 in the magazine Poetry. At Ezra Pound's kind of prodding, he convinced Eliot to publish it. And it immediately changed everything. In terms of content, it could be read as the fictionalized and somewhat depersonalized feelings of a soul feeling profoundly insecure about its own too quickly aging insignificance, and wistful to have lived into its potential, aware of the critical eyes of both the past, tradition, judging us here in the present, and of the future, our descendants judging us here in the present. And under that dual gaze, the speaker, who's sort of this aging man trying to fit in with the fancy people of his day, and feeling small even within his clothing, the speaker just feels tiny, lost, insignificant, too old and weak, and yet at the very same time, too young and foolish. In Prufrock, Eliot referenced and really began a new way of doing poetry. It was a new, what we would call a poetic diction that no longer deferred either to strict meter, right, Shakespeare, or the new faddish but effective kind of passion of like a Walt Whitman, whose free verse was becoming popular. Instead, it integrated both past and future, complex rhyme and vocal rhythm, very conscious of its metrical tradition, and the freedom to break any rule it wanted, whenever it wanted to, into something entirely new and entirely masterful. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells. Streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent to lead you to an overwhelming question. Oh, do not ask, what is it? Let us go and make our visit. Potent stuff. The world had heard nothing like it. And immediately, T.S. Eliot became a literary darling. There are many other very relevant points to Eliot's life, which if we had more time, I would cover. Included an unhappy marriage, really kind of semi-hilarious day jobs. He wrote The Wasteland while toiling as a foreign transactions banker at Lloyd's Bank, in his spare time, barely 2 weeks of vacation a year, eking out a living essentially as a clerk. We could follow him through his literary awards, his face on the cover of Time magazine, his winning of the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1948, his founding of the Criterion, which was one of the most influential literary magazines of the 20th century, his time at Faber and Faber, this huge and very influential literary press where he served as editor. But we're going to kind of set all of that to the side. I think we've introduced the main themes of time that we need to think about. Should you want more, I recommend at some point this biography, T.S. Eliot, A Life by Peter Ackroyd. But now let's turn to what really matters, and that's sort of the internal biography that we get to see in his art. And what we're going to do tonight is we're going to look at his two most important works. We're not going to analyze them in huge literary depth, but we're going to be doing the work that I referenced at the beginning of this time. We're going to be asking, what was this man's relationship to time? How was he answering the question, how can one make peace with time? And one of the joys and the gifts that Eliot gives us is the great honor of being allowed into his inner mind and his inner heart. A poet's work is essentially translation. They take the language of the internal and they bring it out into the world in something that we all can speak. Is it perfect? Never. Is it pretty good? Yes, it can be. And so what Eliot shares and gives to us is the opportunity to see these flashpoints into the same life, the same soul, asking the same questions. And you begin to see a trajectory. We see a man move from this deep sense of disillusionment and decay and confusion to a very, very different end. It's actually incredibly hopeful. And so we'll be examining that. So Prufrock came out in 1915, his first significant publication. 1922, 7 years later, The Wasteland is published. The Wasteland is brilliant, and an exercise in distraction. In its 5 sections, it moves through a bunch of different voices, a bunch of different scenes, and at least 6 different languages. Have Google handy if you want to understand it. It is a masterful achievement, but the title is supremely fitting. The Wasteland. It is unforgiving, bleak, and unrefreshing, like the world Eliot believed he was living in, the modern world. In the poem, Eliot loses himself within a world of his own creation in which memory, illusion, and tradition are brought to bear against the disorientation of the modern world. It's as if he's scrambling for something to hold on to as he finds himself in a cultural and personal desert. What can I grab? Christian tradition, the Hindu scriptures, a sense of a vacation in Austria. There's nothing I can grab. The poem is a lament, and in its way, it's a declaration of war against the incursions of modernist thought. It's really ironic that T.S. Eliot is the person that we remember defining the modernist era in literature, because he hated modernism. He hated the sense that we were moving or progressing away from some foundation of our humanity. It's really interesting. He believed that modernist thought was reductive, taking a whole person and just bringing it down to their economic sense of production. He believed it was destructive, that it made people more prone to violence. And he believed that it was unbelievably arrogant, full of a myth that its progress actually was progress, rather than playing out the same human dramas that had been played out for centuries. So The Wasteland is tremendously effective in its way, has huge cultural impact. Just a few years later, in the novel Brideshead Revisited, the novelist Evelyn Waugh has one of his key cool characters leaning against a windowsill, dramatically reading The Wasteland. It entered the public consciousness to that degree, where it was what the bad boys read, right? It was, I don't know quite what to compare it to. It was what the bad boys read. But the closest that Eliot is able to come to any real sense of comfort in this poem that's architected around the incursions and the loss that time has brought to us. The closest he's able to come, as I said, to any real sense of comfort is near the conclusion in the 5th part, when he references the story of the roads to Emmaus, penning the famous lines, "Who is the third who walks always beside you? When I count, there are only you and I together. But when I look ahead, up the white road, there is always another one walking beside you, gliding wrapped in a brown mantle, hooded. I do not know whether a man or a woman, but who is that on the other side of you?" Right at this moment, when the reader is begging Eliot to recognize that figure, it's Christ. It's Christ who's walking alongside you in this desert. The poet's eye turns. He's distracted. Christ remains hooded. He doesn't take it off. He's not known in the breaking of bread, like the story in Luke tells us. Instead, T.S. Eliot looks upward. What is that sound high in the air? Murmur of maternal lamentation. Who are these hooded hordes swarming over endless plains, stumbling in cracked earth, ringed by the flat horizon only? What is that city over the mountains? Cracks and reforms and bursts in the violet air. Falling towers, Jerusalem, Athens, Alexandria, Vienna, London, unreal. The poet's point is clear in the poem. There is no revelation. The West is falling literally into unreality. England and Austria are on track to join Egypt and Greece. The poem ends with references of fallen royalty and madness. These fragments I have shored against my ruins. And the final utterance, the Sanskrit word shanti, meaning peace, rings ironic and absolutely hollow. It's the definition of saying peace, peace, when there is no peace. And that's it. That's the wasteland. It's done. The wasteland is the song of a culture that has lost its beat, of a life that has lost its beat, that has fallen in the truest of human senses into decadence, decadence. I can't find the beat. We see a man here of potent and clear sight, watching what he loves be lost to the ravages of history, but he does not know what to do with what he sees. He sees the problem. And out of his peripheral vision, if he doesn't focus on it, he can see a figure hooded. But when he looks, they're gone. His clarity is a curse, and he's despairing. It would be really sad if we had lost Thomas Stearns Eliot after The Wasteland. Brilliant and really sad. But fortunately, we didn't. So let us fast forward from 1922 to the publication of The Wasteland to 1943, to the publication of this book. And if you get a chance at the end, come up and see it. This is a 1943 edition of Four Quartets. Not a first edition, but it is a reprint in the year that all four of the poems that made it up was made from Faber and Faber. So this is what Eliot would have held when he got his book in one edition for the first time. It's kind of fun. Eliot did a lot in between those years, of course. There's a lot of time between 22 and 43. But we're going to ignore all of that, except for one thing. In 1927, well after his fame had been assured, 5 years after the publication of The Wasteland, Eliot, in secret, with, I believe, only a priest and one godparent, was baptized into the Anglo-Catholic tradition in a small church in England. This culminated and also began an internal process in Eliot that brought something profound into the life of the poet. It brought a beat. His Christianity was serious, it was thoughtful, it was heartfelt. Though the work of Four Quartets was begun fairly soon after The Wasteland, there's 4 sections to the poem. The first, Burnt Norton, was published in 1936. The majority of the work was written during the height of World War II, and long before victory for the Allies was by any means assured. D-Day was in June of 1944. This book came out in 1943. So what would you expect from the author of The Wasteland, who had so despaired all the way back in 1922, the Gilded Age back then? What would you expect from that same man writing after the rise of fascism in Germany, when his own friend Ezra Pound was under investigation for treason for supporting fascist Italy, supporting Mussolini, when city after city in Europe had fallen to the Third Reich, when London itself had gone through the trauma and the deaths of thousands in the Blitz, which Eliot lived through. What would you expect? Would you not expect despair, agony, anger, rage, an amplification of the disorientation, the disillusionment, the sense of pure desolation that we see in the wasteland. Wouldn't you expect him not even to see the Christ figure even out of his peripheral vision at this point? Of course. That's what a life does, right? It moves on those kinds of trajectories, right? Wrong. Because Eliot had found the beat. Eliot had found a way to make peace with time. Eliot had found a way to make peace with the grief, with the loss, with the sense that nothing in the future could or would be a restoration of what he had so loved and was now gone, in flames, in rubble, in his poor, sick, mentally ill wife cheating on him with Bertrand Russell behind his back, as one does. Good grief. Instead, we find something totally different. So if you're going to begin in one place with T.S. Eliot, it ought to be 4 quartets. We're going to move into the why of that in a moment. It is masterful, it is beautiful, and it is profoundly, deeply true. The book is comprised of 4 matched sections. It's very symmetrical. Each of those 4 sections, which are titled Burnt Norton, East Coker, The Dry Salvages, and Little Gidding, each of those after a geographical place that was very important to Eliot. Each of those are comprised of 5 minor sections, which are very different from each other within those sections, but when you compare them across the 4, they mirror each other in form. Eliot did this on purpose to express a seasonality to the poem, and arguably it's meant to be read as a circle. The end of the poem dovetails very neatly with the beginning of the poem. So if you're reading it, and I've done this many times, I've read it probably 25 to 30 times and have listened to it in Eliot's voice, which is available online. I would also recommend that. Listen to it 5 or 6 times as well. There's an entrancing, intoxicating, seasonal turn to it. You move through the rhythms of the year, through spring, through summer, through fall, and into winter, a winter that holds a spring inside of it. It's very beautiful. He also intentionally has those 4 sections mirror the 4 classical elements: air, earth, water, and fire. And he symbolically moves through each of those, asking, what does each of these types of ways of being, right? Lightness, heaviness, liquidity, and burning. What is the death that is related to that? And what is the life that comes from that? There is a two-handedness and an evenness to the poem that again and again is asking, what is the life of air and what is the death of air? What is the life of earth and what is the death of earth? What is the life of water? What is the death of water? What is the life of fire? What is the death of fire? It truly is one of the most remarkable achievements of modern literature. It embodies, from my perspective, the highest ideals of our language and the greatest capacity of poetry in English. Yeah, let's see. What else would I say about this? Okay. So summing all that up, Eliot intended the poem to be read in the same way that a human life is lived, which is in small circles moving forward, or a spiral. We think of the year as a circle, but of course, we don't go through the same year again and again, do we? We pass through the same seasons in a spiral motion through time. And this is what Eliot is communicating through the form of the poem. And again, as he says things like every phrase and every sentence is an end and a beginning. He uses this language again and again and again. In my end is my beginning. As a careful reader moves through the poem, they will find themselves walking with Eliot through personal memories of regret, all very carefully veiled, through these songs in various voices from throughout history, in meditations on the nature of time, some very philosophical ones. Some of them will just have you sitting there scratching your head as he sets up these ridiculous paradoxes that sound, Solomonic in their wisdom or paradoxical or Stephen Hawking-esque. But they're all highlighting three essential points. First is the idea that the beginnings and the endings in our lives are very much related. They hold each other. Every ending is a beginning. Every beginning ends something. Second, there are these images of union, particularly fire, roses, doves, these very classic language, bits of language from the Christian mystical tradition. References to Julian of Norwich, which we'll get to in a moment as well. Those images of union as the destination of what we want or are looking for in the past. What is it, even in our own lives, or as we think about our culture, when we look towards the past, what is it that we're wanting? We're wanting some connection. We're wanting union with something from that time. And then he returns again and again to that which was the beginning, using images like the river's source, the voice of the hidden waterfall, the children in the apple tree, very enigmatic, but that are very evocative as well for these senses of where we all start. And woven through it all with death. So to return to our question, how do we make peace with time? For Eliot, again and again in 4 quartets, his answer to that question is that we learn to become present in it. He references what he calls the still point at the center of the dance. Life as a dance can only move because of the differentiation allowed by time. He says, words could not exist without time. Music could not exist without time. And he very deftly takes this enemy, this thing that we feel is taking something from us. And in it, he finds the source of joy, the thing from which we are able to draw the dance, the music, the word. And he tells us not to fare well, but to fare forward through it. It is presence in time, not avoidance or distraction. It's not despair, but it's conscious and it's chosen presence that allows us to enter a redeemed relationship to time. In Eliot's image of the dance, joining and being brought into this thing larger than ourselves. There's a beautiful moment in the poem where these rural dancers, these country dancers are stomping out a folk song, and below them, they are being held up by the bodies of their ancestors, by the bodies of the dead who are giving them their hair and their bone, even their feces, he says, right? They're giving all of the stuff of life to these people dancing on them. And then those people on there, they will also go under the hill. They will also hold up this dance, and it's good and it's joyful and God is in it, is what Eliot is saying to us. And it's through that act of return to the source, to the dance, to the beginning, to the beat, an act that is prompted only when we find our end, where we've lost what we feel is everything, that we find transcendence. It's by engaging in the cycle and following it to a childlike, laughing source that we paradoxically are raised above it. In the language of Christianity, we would call this the gospel. We would call this the good news, in which down becomes up, in which lost becomes found, in which death becomes life. In my end, Eliot writes, is my beginning. It is this that allows time to be redeemable. It's participation in the particulars of life. The dancing, the loves that allow for grief, the true connection and true seeing, not the distraction of the wasteland, not the addiction to control that we so easily find creeping into our lives, not the chase of eternal youth that our culture tells us is our proper relationship to time. It's in participation in the loss, participation in the particulars, that we recover the beat. And this brings us to the conclusion of Little Gidding, which in context is one of the most beautiful passages of Christian poetry that our tradition has given to the world, that we see this really come to life. He writes, "The dove descending breaks the air with flame of incandescent terror, of which the tongues declare the one discharge from sin and error. The only hope, or else despair, lies in the choice of pyre or pyre, to be redeemed from fire by fire. Who then devised the torment of time?" Paul says. Who then devised the torment? Love. Love is the unfamiliar name behind the hands that wove the intolerable shirt of flame, time, which human power cannot remove. We only live, only suspire, consumed either by fire or fire. What we call the beginning is often the end, and to make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from, and every phrase and sentence that is right, where every word is at home, taking its place to support the others, the word neither diffident nor ostentatious, an easy commerce of the old and the new, the common word exact without vulgarity, the formal word precise but not pedantic, the complete consort dancing together. Every phrase and every sentence is an end and a beginning, every poem an epitaph. And any action is a step to the block, to the fire, down the sea's throat, or to an illegible stone. And that is where we start. We die with the dying. See, they depart and we go with them. We are born with the dead. See, they return and bring us with them. The moment of the rose and the moment of the yew tree are of equal duration. A people without history is not redeemed from time, for history is a pattern of timeless moments. So while the light fails on a winter's afternoon in a secluded chapel, history is now and England. With the drawing of this love and the voice of this calling, we shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time through the unknown, unremembered gate, when the last of earth left to discover is that which was the beginning, at the source of the longest river, the voice of the hidden waterfall and the children in the apple tree, not known because not looked for, but heard, half heard in the stillness between two waves of the sea. Quick now, here, now, always, a condition of complete simplicity, costing not less than everything. And all shall be well, and all manner of thing shall be well, when the tongues of flame are enfolded into the crowned knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one. In that concluding passage, we sense a man at peace, a hard-earned, honest peace with his art and with the nature of his life. Hidden in there, as he speaks against the ostentatious and the pedantic, is his own critique of the wasteland, so formally exciting and so empty and hollow when you really start knocking on it. It was Eliot's rediscovery of the beat, of tradition as a living thing that gave him a means to survive and transcend the withering, corrosive qualities, not only of modernity, but of time, of this weird thing we're all swimming in. And he was distilled by his experiences of alienation, not deconstructed or taken apart by them. And this, I believe, brings us to the great gift, to the handle that Eliot has for us tonight. Because his development, which was so public and so beautifully expressed, shows us one of the great hopes of our spiritual tradition, our capacity to grow in understanding, peace, and presence. We recover the beat, not by just getting smarter, but by being more present in the particulars of our life, by noticing in faith, as Julian of Norwich so aptly said, and as Eliot quoted at the end, that all shall be well, and all manner of thing shall be well. I fear that I've only scratched the surface of Eliot's life and thought, and I'm very conscious of how much I'm leaving out tonight. But if you take nothing else from our distinguished guest, Thomas Stearns Eliot, take a deeper appreciation for the capacity of time, which so many of us really do think of as an enemy. Take a deeper appreciation for what it can give to us. Because when we seek the still point, the stillness between those two waves of the sea, we find the paradoxical presence in which time past and time future may be united and come to life, set on fire now. We find, returning to that image of the wasteland, that veiled figure begins to take the hood down, and that in the particularity of our life, we notice that there is someone extra walking alongside us, and we can recognize him as Christ. So with that, let us follow the example of T.S. Eliot, each in our own way, and ask how we might join that eternal dance. Thanks.
You actually gave a beautiful gift to Paul. You didn't say a word when he finished. And you were pretty sure that clapping wouldn't do it, but you did it anyway. But you felt it, right? It wasn't quite appropriate. It didn't do it. It's good to notice that. The stillness was the gift that you gave him. It occurs to me that it's not possible to consider time an enemy when you've had an hour of time with Paul Pastor. Thank you, Paul. This is called the night school, and I'll tell you why. It's not because the night school happens at night that I called it the night school. It's called the night school, taken from a passage in the Gospel of John, where a man named Nicodemus comes at night to talk to Jesus. And the reason he does is he's been overwhelmed by a teaching that was so beyond his categories, broke so many of his sureties, and yet as it did it, it gave so much that he realized the architecture of his thoughts, the pattern of his religious thinking was simply no longer sufficient for what he just experienced. And when that happens, it's like an experience of darkness. But as someone would say, it's a holy darkness. And suddenly, one feels blind by too much light. This was the goal of the night school and each of the guests we bring. And Paul was a perfect example. To so fill you with the richness of a guest, and in this case, what he did, a suggestion of the depth of his gift, that it leaves you blinded in a certain way, and you really don't know any questions to ask or smart things to reply. You're just sort of left full. And I hope you just let it stay that way. Don't try to reduce it. Well, this is what he meant, or, well, how was the night school tonight? Well, there's this thought and this thought. It won't be adequate for the gift that was given tonight. So just let it wreck things a little bit. Break down the pattern of our normal way of thinking. The last thought is this. I remember in my life, I had the privilege at times to be able to speak in front of my parents. And it meant a lot to me to be able to do it, but also to watch their faces and wonder, what are they thinking as they see me doing my thing? I wish I could have sat behind Paul and watched your guy's face as you looked at your son with amazement and wondered, where did he get all this? Isn't it something what our son has become? So I just want to acknowledge that you're here, what it must have meant to Paul that you did come. And we hope you'll give a huge donation and help us build a new tower downtown. Thank you so much for that. Anyway, Mary, would you come on up and just close us out here?
Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you all for being here again. Thank you to our people online from all over that joined us as well. I did want to mention that Paul has a couple of his books out this way. If you're interested in purchasing books, having him sign it. And there's also still some food and drink, so feel free to stay and mingle if you would like. As I mentioned, we do host these gatherings one Tuesday a month, the last Tuesday of the month. And next month, we will be hosting here again the end of April with our special guest of Jane Jacobs. And that will be around the idea of cities and communities and how they're built and how they operate. And I think that is especially relevant in our time right now. Also, another one of the habits of the Faber Institute is each month we host the Faber sessions, which is online only. And right now it is around poetry. And so the second Monday of each month, we have those. And coming up in April, so in a couple weeks, we'll be focusing on Emily Dickinson, and Father Gaines will lead us in that class. So anyway, I'll send out information on those upcoming gatherings in our follow-up email Thank you so much for being here. Feel free to stay if you would like, and otherwise we'll see you next time. Thanks.